Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am extra excited to have Juanita Lee-Garcia on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. And it's very fitting because Juanita is a kind of godmother of the Venture for Canada podcast. She actually created the name A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. And I really view as kind of the co-founder of the Venture for Canada podcast. Juanita and I worked together for around 5 years at Venture for Canada, where we collaborated extremely closely together. And I think Juanita is a really thoughtful person as it relates to philanthropy in Canada and the future of philanthropy. And she is currently the executive director of the Upside Foundation. Really excited for this conversation. Juanita, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott, and that's so kind. Definitely a full circle moment, and the name was actually a team effort. The whole Venture for Canada team voted, and I'm just incredibly proud of all of the guests that you've had, and I'm so honored to be included as one of those guests. I feel like I look up to every single person that you interview, and always find the conversations just so deep and honest, and I hope that I can bring that to the podcast as well.
Thanks for that, Juanita. And I am looking forward to the conversation today. To dive into the episode theme, how do you envision the future of philanthropy evolving over the next decade?
I think to start to think about philanthropy, we really have to think about how philanthropy is defined. And over the last year, I've Googled different definitions of philanthropy. And when you quickly look it up, I think things around like the love for humanity in a sense of caring and nurturing comes up, making life better for other people comes up. But ultimately, the consensus around what is philanthropy is that philanthropy is the action of recognizing and um, uh, initiating an exchange of assets or capital or time, but specifically, it's seen as financially committing to a cause that is going to elevate humanity. And the conversations around philanthropy are kind of starting to shift in like systems change. So how do we modify the conditions that prevent people from fully realizing their true humanity or ultimate potential? And so when I think about what does the future of philanthropy in Canada look like, I feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads, to be honest. I feel like often I'm living in two very different Canadas, and I think it's just a larger sentiment of the times in politics. You're starting to see polarization since the COVID-19 pandemic has risen, and within philanthropy, the ideologies around philanthropy have also become more polarized. Ultimately, philanthropy is an ideology within a capital system. And when we're talking about philanthropy, we're talking about money and generosity, which is a very gray area. Like we don't operate in blacks or whites related to the spectrum of like ideology, because um, it involves this massive topic that's still considered very taboo for a lot of folks in a lot of cultures. It's a conversation of wealth and legacy, and those are really big concepts that people feel really strongly about, tied to their political views, tied to their religious beliefs. And ultimately, it's like how we're choosing to spend our money. So the crossroads that we're at is more of a fork, and I see the conversation moving down kind of three ways. One is that larger ideological conversation of, how does philanthropy exist, tied to the conversation of should billionaires exist? And I know that you're a big New York Times reader, so am I, and kind of tap into a lot of different news sources, but that's a really big kind of question, is like, should there be billionaires? And that's the kind of one ideological path. The other kind of kind of future of philanthropy is a more practical one, which is what are the expectations around funding for social causes that should come from philanthropy versus government in a highly taxed society, which a lot of Canadians would say Canada is a highly taxed society with a highly sophisticated tax infrastructure. And the third is just a more practical conversation with those folks who currently practice philanthropy. So, ultra high net worth and high net worth individuals that are exploring different ways of practicing philanthropy, which is the more traditional donor recognition exchange of a donation for a wing at a hospital. I think that's going to continue to happen. I think that's so deeply woven within fundraising environments, specifically institutionalized environments. But there's some new ways in which folks are starting to think about it, which is the space that I currently find myself in, which is more venture philanthropy. And so that's kind of, I think, the next 10 years of the Canadian philanthropic conversation and actioning.
Your career path has been such an interesting one, and I think it's an important context as part of this conversation. So, Juanita, can you describe a little bit what has your career journey been into the philanthropic sector?
Oh yeah. Well, it actually started. So my background is in the arts. So I feel like I've always kind of been exposed to philanthropy or been a beneficiary of philanthropy in many ways. When I immigrated to Canada in 2007, my parents immigrated as political refugees, and I had loved art my whole life. And there was a program actually at the National Art Gallery tied with the Canadian Institute of Citizenship where youth under 18 could go to the art gallery and get free access to like this art after school camp. So that's what I did that summer when I moved to Ottawa. And I went to the art gallery and had an incredible instructor. And that was a program that was funded by a family that really believed in how important Canadian arts were to Canadian culture and citizenship. And so they wanted to bring in newcomers into the art gallery. And so that's kind of like my first interactions with philanthropy was actually like as a recipient and being really aware of how other people could have made this happen for me. When I went to Queens, I got a few scholarships, and a lot of the request from the university was that we would wear like a pin to thank donors that had given scholarships for specific fields, um, and again, like as a recipient of philanthropy. And I never really thought about it much related to my career path beyond their capacity building towards what I was able to do. So it was really, gratitude, like a place where I approached it from like, oh, these people who, don't know me gave this money that I'm now like benefiting from and just have immense gratitude for that. Um, but it was actually mostly through our work at Venture for Canada fundraising that I got to know different philanthropists that you worked with and you introduced me to. That was really, really eye opening in the different ways in which people want to support different causes that they care about. And that led to kind of my role today, which is um, working with startup founders. So at Venture for Canada, we worked with entrepreneurial youth, and many of them became entrepreneurs themselves. And one of my responsibilities was to oversee our alumni relations. And I ended up having some really incredible relationships and conversations with Venture for Canada alumni who started these businesses. And in just our regular conversations, we would talk about how they wanted to build businesses with a lot of impact and businesses that, and what does impact mean for a startup? What does impact mean for their media company? What does impact mean for their consulting practice or whatever they were doing that was entrepreneurial? And a lot of them wanted to find ways to give back. And so in just those conversations, I started to explore, and how can entrepreneurs start to give back when they don't necessarily have that capital. And a lot of it is through time, right? So that like a lot of folks feel like they gave back through committing time to an organization that they care about, either as advisors or more ad hoc volunteers. And working with those founders was just, always so inspiring. And there was the Upside Foundation that had this model of corporate social responsibility built in for entrepreneurs. And so it was something that I wanted to learn more about. And I got approached for the role. And really the concept is that founders with no capital can pre-commit capital through equity to causes that they care about or through to their potential future foundation. Because tech is one of the fastest speeds to wealth in Canada, that really interested me, and was really interesting to see how like entrepreneurs that were focused within the innovation economy wanted to give back in different ways. It's not a new concept. This concept of 1% of equity towards a cause has been around for a long time. The MasterCard Foundation is actually the perfect example of that. I talk about the MasterCard Foundation as one of those like origin stories of, in I think it was 1966 when the folks down in the U.S. decided to come up with this credit lending uh, uh, credit card, and they had committed equity for an independently ran foundation if they ever had a successful IPO. It took them 40 years to IPO, so they IPO'd in 2006, and that's how the MasterCard Foundation, which I think is arguably North America's, I think it's the largest foundation in North America, $36 billion in assets last time I checked, was formed. Now you can IPO in 5 years. You can build really incredible tech companies that have these like very fast speeds to exit. And so I was really interested in thinking about collectively what could Canada's tech community do that could have as big of an impact as MasterCard did in the U.S. philanthropic sector.
One thing that I think about often with regards to philanthropy is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And philanthropy can be a tremendous source for good, but it can, in some cases, actually make things worse. So, Juanita, what are some of the ways that you think that philanthropy is making Canada a worse place?
Oh, that's a big question. I think there's a couple of things. I think philanthropy is making Canada a worse place when we really look at it as an exchange of services or as another consumer product. So, breaking it down kind of like in three ways. One is when we start to commodify people because of their trauma or their stories, to get like funders to fund a certain cause. So I would say that, for example, with the newcomer crisis or the refugee crisis, really saying these, people are products, and you can hear their stories. Here's like really telling you personal information about these people just so that we can get to support them. I think it creates really dangerous power dynamics between those who are at need and those who have the ability to give. So that's the first one. I think the second one, in ways in which philanthropy could potentially be making Canada a worse place, is that there's so many registered charities in Canada. It's over 80,000 registered charities in Canada, and a lot of those are actually foundations themselves that deploy money. So, right, as a foundation, you get charitable status yourself. There's, the three types of charities: public foundations, private foundations, and programming charities. And people put their money in a foundation or a donor advised fund at a bank as almost like a charitable pool that actually doesn't get distributed to community. So, really thinking about charitable banking. Like, I have money, I'm going to put it in a bank. My assets are going to grow. I'm going to grow my endowments, and I'm just going to deploy the bare minimum every year. I think that's making Canada worse. I think it enables people to take advantage of different tax infrastructures that we have. um, and then really just kind of have like a little pocket of money that they can just give away to causes that they get approached about for things like, exchanges of services. So, like, if you donate, you could get access to this gala or to this board or to these things. And so I think in some ways having that system set up doesn't enable us to actually look at larger scale systems change. Um, and I think the third is like really not, philanthropy could make Canada worse by continuing to perpetuate certain things that we just haven't addressed, right? Like there's so much opportunity within truth and reconciliation in Canada. There's so much opportunity within like having conversations that can give people money directly. And I think it's that second prong that I brought up, which is like, what is the government's responsibility versus what is philanthropy's responsibility? And when people think that the government should be taking care of something, therefore they don't give to that cause, um, I think that could make Canada worse.
It's such an interesting question because I think that there's so much positive that does come out of philanthropy. And I think it's great that people are philanthropists. And I think that there can sometimes be drawbacks to philanthropy, and I think it's important to be aware of both the pros and the cons. And I think often that when people think of philanthropy, they think, "Oh, it's just good," and largely yes, but it's also important to be mindful of how the road to hell can be paved with good intentions, and that philanthropy can be complicated. So, flipping on a more positive note, Juanita, what are some positive trends that you're seeing in the philanthropic sector?
Um, there are some really incredible organizations out there that I've been following in Canada that are doing some really interesting philanthropic work. One of the ones that I really admire is Dragonfly Ventures, and this falls within that kind of vertical of venture philanthropy that I kind of touched on earlier, which is folks that have individual folks, right? Like that have access to a lot of capital for whatever reason, whether it's inherited wealth, whether it is exiting a business and doing really well, whether it's intergenerational Canadian wealth. And Dragonfly Ventures has a very interesting approach, which is an investment, a donation, a granting, um, and a donation, an investment, a gift, which is gifting, and an investment approach. And so, um, through financial vehicles and non-financial vehicles, which is really kind of thinking about philanthropy holistically, right? Like, I think the legacy, the donor legacy used to be that you gave money and maybe it was anonymous until you passed away, or you gave money and then didn't give, you had maybe like an honorary role or some type of, chairman role, or were recognized again, like through a plaque. But really, I think non financial vehicles of providing connections, advice, access to other folks is super interesting. So it's kind of the emerging field of integrated capital, um, and really looking at how do you also um, invest without necessarily expecting a return. So like um, investing at a zero, at a minimal return rate, or not taking any equity, or lending at a 0% rate, and then asking for that money back once a business is off the ground or a social enterprise is off the ground. Um, to allow folks to try new things within their community and having it be community led. So that's also like a big trend that is really important right now, which is like, what is the community that you're trying to support or interested in supporting saying that they need? And it could be as simple as, if you're interested in women and are honing in on women's economic development, and you understand that there's a lot of women in Canada who face domestic violence. And so they, if they have to go to a shelter, that enables obviously their ability to go to work. And the shelter needs an elevator because the elevator is broken. Knowing that fixing the elevator is helping those women just as much, like um, as another component of the organization. So if they tell you, hey, we really want an elevator, listening to the community about, that's just like a silly example, but really listening to the communities around what they're saying that they need, and trusting that they have the autonomy and financial sense to make those decisions around the money that you are, or capital that you are providing them.
Which is a great segue to explore trust-based philanthropy, and which is such an increasingly important topic within the broader philanthropic sector, popularized by some leading philanthropists who've decided to donate most of their money in a trust-based way. But maybe to dive a little bit deeper into like what is trust-based philanthropy, Juanita?
Um, ooh, like there's actually, like, I think a pretty good definition in social innovation review that uses. I don't know it off the top of my head, but the gist of trust based philanthropy is um, to really trust that um, organizations, so charities and nonprofits, and the people running them uh, know and have the tools to effectively manage that capital. And so it's not saying, hey, take this money and do whatever you want with it without repercussions. It's saying, hey, we've evaluated the work that you've done, and you've proven that you have the capacity to deliver on this. And we want to give you this gift with, not that many constraints, so that you can then tell us what you want to do with the money and report that back to us. So it's really saying, like, removing some of the power dynamics where a funder, traditionally has said, these are the targets that you should hit, but rather inform the funder on, like, how you're going to deploy that capital and set those targets yourself. And so instead of, a funder saying you have to support, like using another example around, uh, let's say kids, you have to put 50 kids through your STEM program. It's saying, okay, with this money, what capacity do you have and how many kids do you think you could serve? Try different things and then come back to us and let us know how many kids you ended up putting through your STEM program. So it's really giving the organizations the autonomy to make the financial decisions, knowing that they have the ability to do so. It's not like, uh, you know, giving your money away freely and saying, spend it on whatever you want. If you want to buy 50 pounds of candy, which I think is one of the debates that people have in trust based philanthropy, is like, how do we know they're going to spend it on the right things? But there's a lot of evaluation that goes beforehand. And I think that that's what's missing in the conversation. And there's a lot of relationship building too that goes beforehand into trust based philanthropic exchanges of funds.
And for additional context for our listeners, typical philanthropy or traditional philanthropy would be there's like a foundation, there's a program officer. They say you can spend 10K on event costs, 20K on salaries, 5K in administration, et cetera, et cetera. You get the deal. And a question I have for you, Juanita, is why do you think the default is like traditional philanthropy rather than trust based philanthropy?
From a practical standpoint, I think um, it's really, it's easier to manage, right? I think there is some practicality to saying, hey, this is what we've seen in the past, this is what people traditionally spend, and so we're just going to go with the average. This is kind of what's worked before, um and that's giving the funder a benefit of doubt, right? Like, that's saying, like, funders try and also systematize things. It's really hard to deploy capital. Anyone goes through it. If you have $1 billion, you want to ensure that you're deploying that capital responsibly, and so you start to create systems and processes and standardized measurements, and I think that that's where a lot of those frameworks came from. Right, was like, we need to ensure that we're giving everyone a fair chance, and why could this organization spend, why is this organization saying that they're going to need to spend 20,000 on administrative cost and this one saying 10? Let's come up with some guidelines. And so I think truly with giving funders the benefit of doubt is that it's a way of systematizing things, because deploying capital is really difficult. Responsible capital, like deploying capital responsibly, is really difficult. And you're seeing that with interesting shifts with Mackenzie Scott as a billionaire deploying a lot more capital than other billionaires in the US. Um, because relationship building takes time. Understanding community takes time. Um, Understanding the systems around a community takes time. But there's a lot of experts. And so I think um, that's why, that's kind of why the system, I think ideologically, um, it does come down to having like a set of norms or established power dynamics, um, really thinking that you have to operate a business in a certain way. And and foundations are, are businesses. People, have run businesses to be able to have this kind of capital. And so sometimes I think um, we implement the same kind of rigor to the different things that we run in our lives. And so an entrepreneur or a tech entrepreneur or a oil and gas person might have managed their business that way. And so they expect for the charities to manage their business that way. Um, and it's really not, it's there's where the disconnect around understanding the community that the organizations are serving and why an organization might need salaries to be really high. If you're working with um, youth, indigenous youth in Canada that need trauma informed therapists, those therapists have gone through a lot of schooling to get to where they are, and they need to be paid what their what their jobs, what the level of the job is in order to provide the right service. And so instead of expecting salaries to be X because you're part of the charitable sector versus like, oh, the folks that work for this organization that's a charity are all PhDs in this and they really need to have this deep expertise, they should be compensated at this rate, is something that I don't think funders traditionally have looked at because they haven't necessarily looked at this idea that they're funding communities.
Yeah, a really thoughtful answer. And it also makes me think about the burden a lot of nonprofits and charities can have just reporting on everything. Venture for Canada, we're actually in a pretty good situation compared to a lot of organizations. And as I become involved with nonprofits outside of Venture for Canada, I've come to appreciate just the burden that some nonprofits and charities have of just spending so much time reporting on how they're spending the money that it can really make the organization very challenged in terms of its ability to operate. Luckily, BFC, we are not in that position. But to dive deeper and to think a little bit about like reimagining the charitable sector, um, uh, Juanita, how do you think on a practical level we can, on a systems level, reduce some of that administrative burden that charities have so that they can focus on the important work that they're doing rather than reporting on the important work that they're doing?
Yeah, and so I think a really big distinction for those who aren't familiar to like kind of mixing the charitable sector, both from like a government standpoint. I understand government reporting. That's one thing, right? Like when you get funds from the public sector and it's taxpayer dollars, and so that's one source of funding that I think charities get that should have high rigor in reporting. When it comes to donors, and or as philanthropists and big foundations, um, I think at a systems level, there's very few individuals in Canada that have that type of wealth. That I actually think they could all come together. My goal would my dream would be to go to like Canada's philanthropic consortium with some of Canada's largest private funders and some of Canada's biggest foundations and like really look at these conversations. Um, I think on the one end, like does it create more efficiencies on your team? Does a team actually evaluate the um, the funding proposals that they're getting with that much rigor that like you actually need that reporting? Like, what do you actually need that reporting for? And if it's they don't have to report it to anyone else. A private foundation or even private foundation doesn't have to report to anyone why they are deploying those metrics, where they're deploying that funding or looking for those metrics. It's really ran as a closed doors organization. And so, like, are you reporting it to get data so that you can deploy research? Are you collecting that data to run a think tank and do something with it. And I think that that's like the biggest question that organizations need to ask themselves when they're asking for so much reporting is like, what is this reporting actually telling us? And is it telling is if it's, if we're asking all these questions and it's not giving us a clear answer of like whether this organization is making an impact, like you don't need that much information to know whether an organization is making an impact. You can ask them, you can ask their community, you can do some, quantitative and qualitative research to understand the system's need for that, and then you can just let them run with it. But I think it's really saying like, what do we need this reporting for, and is this sufficient for our own team? And I doubt that it's sufficient for their own teams to be evaluating those reports. I can't imagine how much time a foundation officer is actually spending on reading those reports and then trying to pull something out of them. And so I really think it's about efficiencies and trying to think about how do we more effectively run the charitable or like the Canada's charitable sector, and that's reducing reporting.
The role of a lot of program officers, I think, can be somewhat dry because your point, if you're just reading through these reports all day, like what is the point of the reports? And I think sometimes that they can be very, very valuable, but it's a question too of how can you make reporting add value beyond reporting for its own sake. And I think that there's ways to mobilize knowledge from reporting. I think there's ways to like demonstrate impact. I think that reporting can actually be more than reporting, but it often isn't. And another kind of hot button issue within the charitable sector to zoom in on is the question of multiple legal structures. So, for the context of our listeners, sometimes you have a charity and there's a non for profit arm, or there's a charity that owns a for profit business. Venture for Canada, we are one entity, Venture for Canada. There are no multiple entities. But most famously with We Charity, there was there was like 15 entities, and then that organization went belly up largely because of scandals related to the multiple entity. And there were a lot of things about We Charity. It's been talked about, ad nauseum in a lot of different ways. But a question I have for you, Juanita, is do you think that there is something inherently risky for there to be multiple legal entities, in particular, for there to be for profit entities related to charitable or not for profit entities, and that legal structure inherently creates governance challenges and the risk of private benefit?
Beyond like the legal risk and the governance risk, there's also social risk, and very few people outside the charitable sector understand those structures. And I think that that's actually the biggest risk that charities face is that the majority of Canadians don't understand the difference between a registered charity and a nonprofit, and the delivery of those services. And so, when they're looking to donate or when they're looking to gift, and we know that a lot of Canadians, or when they're looking to engage in programs, they actually don't know what they're engaging in. They don't know if they're participating in a program ran by a nonprofit, or they think it's a nonprofit, but they don't really understand, and so they get confused if there's fees. People don't know that charities can charge fees. So I think it's actually a consumer problem. Because we assume that people know the different structures, but they don't. And so they think most Canadians, and I would love to find a stat on this. I actually don't know if it's been like surveyed, like we'll say like, oh yeah, I'm participating, I have ad hoc, these are anecdotes, but they'll say like, oh, I'm volunteering for this charity. And I'm like, oh, that's actually not a charity. That's the for-profit arm of a charity that exists, but what you're volunteering for is actually not the charitable arm. You're volunteering for a for-profit company. Or, oh, I'm doing this program that's funded, it's government funding, therefore that content must be, it's ran by a charity, and it's actually, again, no, this is a for-profit company or for-profit tech company delivering a government funded program that is in partnership with a bunch of other charities. And so I think that it creates a consumer problem, and I think it creates a larger problem around how people view the charitable sector, how people view how people should be compensated within the charitable sector, what kind of things should come out of the charitable sector within like the 5 pillars of the charitable sector. one of the biggest conversations right now is like, can we get more clarity on what does it mean to be an advancement of religion charity in Canada? Because legally, that's very murky. And so I think that there's huge risks, but there's also a lot of opportunities. What I love about some of the venture philanthropy models that are expanding outside of just funding registered charities is that it does enable you to create a social enterprise. So an entrepreneurial business with a underlying social cause, whether that means all of your employees are folks with disabilities, or all of your employees are previously incarcerated folks. It allows businesses that have deeper social mandates to also access capital. Um, so you can grant to a nonprofit now as a foundation. Um, uh, Again, different kind of family offices are setting up like their venture philanthropy as being able to provide debt solutions or financing at 0% to get businesses off the ground, and that's kind of seen as a new form of philanthropy. And so definitely risky for organizations themselves who don't necessarily know how to run it. Often you have to have different lawyers for your different entities, different accountants, different boards. And so if you have the capacity and the expertise to run it in a way that is ethical and legal, do it, because it expands their opportunities. But if you don't, it could you could lose your charitable status. You can get into really murky waters, for sure. And I'm not the biggest fan of. I'm not a lawyer, and I've had to look at a lot of different contracts, and I, the CRA doesn't have the most interpretable language there could be. So I think that's also what's really hard, is that it's really murky waters.
It can work in some contexts, but it's really important to set up properly, is what I'm hearing from you. Shifting gears a little bit to the final kind of topic, which is around next generation philanthropy. And right now,
Mm.
we're in the mix of one of the largest intergenerational, if not the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in the history of Canada. And there are many young philanthropists all of a sudden, from Gen Z to millennial, and there's going to be way more of them in the future. How do you think Gen Z and millennial philanthropists potentially could shake up the philanthropic sector?
Oh, well, hopefully they shake it up. I think, and you might know the stat, but my understanding is that that within the intergenerational transfer, there's about $1 trillion in Canada. Do you know if that's correct? That's like specifically Canadian. That's going to happen in Canada. That is an unbelievable amount of money that is currently actively ready to be deployed. Um, I think I keep saying, venture philanthropy is probably the way in which it's going to be um, shaken up the most. And so, what I'm seeing is a lot of second generation or third generation, um, not necessarily care as much about things like legacy. So that's one. And so in not necessarily caring about legacy, they're not looking to fund things like where they get their last name on a building, or where they get that public recognition. But what we're seeing within my space, specifically related um, to tech founders and the tech community, is that they're setting up family offices that are looking at cost-based giving. So not necessarily saying we're going to give to these organizations, but these are the causes that we care about, and it's like an open call. So if you apply by this date, you're likely to get funding. So I think that's one interesting way, is like, if you have a call for $100 million, and then you say anyone who applies to this could get a piece of the pot. regardless of how much it is, like whether it's 1,000 or whether it's 100,000 of that 100 million. I think that's really interesting, and I think that could really shift the ways in which we give people the opportunity to be entrepreneurial in the nonprofit sector. Um, I think there's going to be a lot more impact measurement and management. And so, like, looking at a nonprofit in a similar way of, um, in a similar way that they're looking at like businesses to scale. So, is it possible that philanthropy could merge nonprofits, like a bunch of organizations that are trying to do the same thing? And instead of saying, hey, you're all trying to do the same thing in different approaches, like let's build a larger organization and let's go through a merger. So like um, something which happens in SaaS all the time, right? Like there's like a bigger organization that buys a bunch of different tech companies and then creates a larger product out of them. I think that could be a really interesting way in which uh, philanthropists like could think, or they're thinking like asset managers, they're thinking like yeah, like new ways of thinking in business, like and then I think kind of like the last way is a combination of that tailored financing. So again, like instruments like debts, loans, uh, equity, uh, thinking around, how does a nonprofit actually become financially sustainable through different revenue models, and like kind of applying that investor's lens to it. Um, and giving a lot more of that advice through those non-financial supports. So setting potentially up a different type of board. If we could reshift nonprofits boards roles in Canada, that would be, I think, led by philanthropists who might not necessarily put themselves on a board, but they might put, a really strategic advisor on their team on a board, like a product manager on a board of, you know, a, a mental health charity that's looking to implement AI. And so, like, really leveraging their network and their resources to put the right people in the right place to advance those organizations. And I think also understanding, like, not everything is scalable. I would add that, like, I think a lot of the way in which we think right now is about scale, right? Like, I think all of those three examples that I gave are about scaling. And I think that that's a way that a lot of philanthropists have looked at funding is how do you get bigger? How do you reach more people? How do you help more? How do we create more wings in a hospital to help more women? Because women's health is under researched in Canada. But I think that there's also an opportunity for us to think about what doesn't need to scale within complex social problems. Like, what are those problems that just need to be taken care of, but we don't necessarily have to scale the solution. Um, and that's, I think, a really interesting question for this next generation is like, do we need to scale everything?
Bigger isn't always better in terms of nonprofit programming. And I think a lot of times people think you need to scale everything. Juanita, you provided so many different insights on the future of philanthropy. I think that for folks who do not work in the philanthropic sector or are not deeply involved in it, it can sometimes be a little bit of a black box where people aren't aware of the sector's complexity and also how we are, I think, at the precipice of a period of significant change in how nonprofits and charities function. These are institutions that, from my own experience, often can be quite like risk averse, but I think that external environment is causing a lot of nonprofits and charities to have to evolve really quickly. And that's because philanthropy, which is a major source of funding, or at least historically has been, is evolving really quickly. Very excited to follow your career as you continue to get further involved in the philanthropic sector in Canada. And thanks for everything you've done to build Venture for Canada and a new wave of entrepreneurship. Thanks so much for being on the show, Juanita.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate it. And I'm far from an expert. I feel like the learning journey in this is just starting, and there's so much history to it in Canada. There's been so many efforts made since the early 2000s. We have a highly sophisticated banking sector. The McConnell Foundation was really one of the first kind of foundations that through you I was exposed to like really learn about social innovation and social impact, and um, you really shaped my career in this space. So I owe a lot to Venture for Canada, and I am so excited to see what the next 10 years. I know we're approaching 10 years, or we approached 10 years this year. You're celebrating your 10 years, and what the next 10 years of this entrepreneurial journey that you've taken as a leader in the nonprofit sector will take the organization.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Juanita. Talk to you later.
Bye, Scott.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.